Good evening, folks. I'm a little bit late, 1:06 I make it. Welcome to what I think is the last actual lesson. I think we meet again in 2 weeks' time, but then I'll do a live preview of the final POE. I know many of you probably have some questions and are concerned about the assignment, etc. And I will give opportunity at the end of the session for questions about tonight's lesson. Traditionally, tonight's session doesn't last very long, and so I'll give opportunity at the end of the session for questions on tonight's session, and then obviously questions if anybody has any questions around the soon due assignment. I'm happy to take questions about that at that point. Okay, folks, let's get straight into emerging economies and entrepreneurship. This is a bit of a fancy or a strange one. I rushed home tonight to present this session, so I haven't been able to check on ARC. There are 3-4 articles. Let me just show you. Those are the prescribed articles, 3 articles that are part of that are the prescribed materials. And I can, for the life of me, not recall whether I uploaded these articles onto ARC at the beginning of the semester or not. I normally do, but I'm not sure if I did. In any case, if I haven't, I will do that first thing tomorrow morning. If you can't find them there, they will be under the prescribed articles for this section. I will also upload a briefing document. The briefing document would basically be a summary, a commentary, a document that looks at all 3 of those articles and gives you a once over on them. I find that even at the 3rd year level, students sometimes struggle to master the reading of these academic articles. So I then also make a summary available or a discussion document available for students that's sometimes easier to read and easier to use than the originals. So we've got 3 articles there. The first article talks about how the how transition takes place within the entrepreneurship in Africa's emerging economies. In other words, how we transition from a purely entrepreneurial type of economy into a serious economy that starts to compete with the first world. Then the second one talks about the entrepreneurship and strategy in emerging economies. How do we approach it? And then the last one talks about entrepreneurship education, empowering the township members to take ownership of the township economy. And we'll talk briefly about the township economy. Township economy tends to be a different economy, or a other economy than the economy that we traditionally used to. Somebody like myself, who grew up outside of a township, needs to read and understand quite widely to understand exactly how that separate economy works and how it developed. But we'll chat a little bit about that later on tonight. So here are our learning outcomes. So there are 7 learning outcomes for this unit. And I have on this slide, and if you listen to the recording, you might want to stop this and take a screenshot of the slide. I've broken down each one of the learning outcomes according to the appropriate source. So the 7 learning outcomes are each broken down towards a source to make life easier for you, so that if you, in the POE, the final document, need to answer questions on this, you know where to go start looking for it. And I'll also speak to that in the final briefing in 2 weeks' time, but I'll also mention it now, that these articles are not enough when you are answering final questions. You need to use them as a basis, and then from them go start looking at broader reading and other articles as well. So it's important to note that although we're giving you these are not really the ones that you need more than this. Okay, so how this is going to work is I'm going to dive into each one of the learning units, give you a bit of an overview, talk a bit about that learning unit, and then move to the next. So I've got 7 or 8 slides coming up, and each 1 or 2 of those slides will deal with the learning unit per slide. As always, please, guys, feel free to unmute yourself and say, Carl, sorry, you're talking nonsense, or how does this work, or yeah, this makes me think of something else. Or if you're that way inclined, you can put your hand up and wait for me to see your hand. And the problem is, as I present, I sometimes don't always see the hands go up. So feel free to unmute and speak to me, or feel free to type. And if I don't see the chat pop up, please somebody just shout and say, hey, Carl, have a look at the chat. There's a question for you. Okay, guys, so here we go. Explain the concept of an emerging economy. So emerging economies are interesting animals because we're looking at countries that are developing from a low income, a low base into middle and high income statuses. In other words, we're looking at countries that traditionally weren't the best earners. And I'm going to speak about why briefly, and that have now started becoming earners. So you find countries that had resources that they didn't know. If you want to have a look at countries like that, go look at a country like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Go look at their pictures and videos and so on about their country 50 years ago. Desert camels, migratory people struggling to make a living, compared to bustling cities and so on, because they had a resource called oil that they didn't know they had. And once oil was discovered and oil was managed rather well, they then had the opportunity to develop the country, and they reinvested that money into the country, into the people. And that's, I'm naming the UAE, but many of the central Middle Eastern countries have the same type of attitude towards it, where the country is actually so rich and they've developed from a very, very low income to such a high income that most of the locals don't even work, or they don't want to work. They get a stipend from government and so on, and they will work in what we would call a good job, but they won't work in manual labor. Much of the manual labor is done by foreigners, people, for example, from the Philippines, India, and so on, people from low-income countries that go to these high-income countries to generate an income. So that's one class of country that emerges. Another class is a country that has been exploited by other countries, much of Africa. If you go look at Brazzaville, Congo, DRC, Congo, and these places, and Belgium, and I'm not picking on Belgium, I'm just using that as an example. Most of the colonial masters were guilty of it, where they had exploited those countries and they'd simply stripped the resources, exported the resources, and used those resources to build their own countries. And in many cases, when emancipation came, and when those countries became independent from the colonial masters, the colonial masters literally left overnight. In Angola, for example, it was basically 2-3 weeks and they were out of there after the elections were lost in Portugal. When the conservatives were lost to the liberals, they call them something else, but it's basically a conservative party that was happy with colonialism. Liberals took over and they said, we're not interested in colonies, and they ducked out of Angola quick. Same thing happened in Mozambique. When the Gambia, if you don't know where the Gambia is, go look at a map of Africa. There's on the bulge of Africa, one of those small strip of countries, it's called the Gambia. There's a brilliant book, if you can lay your hands on it, it's called Enter the Gambia, that talks exactly about that period. When Gambia gained independence, they had one person with a degree in the whole country, one Gambian with a degree. Now you can imagine now those countries have to run the The country has to run the economy. And obviously people aren't going to mismanage it because they don't know, they haven't been trained, they haven't been educated in it. And thus these countries then go into a slump. Over time, skills are developed. Hopefully somebody manages the country correctly, and then these countries start rising because they start using their own resources to the benefit of the country. Of course, we have the problem in Africa that in many cases it's not used to the benefit of the country. I'm trying to remember the country that had a coup and they've now got a young military leader. I think it's Burkina Faso, who has now started working using the resources, and the country's growing like that. So that's the other part of it, that countries struggle because of not having the knowledge and so on after emancipation from colonialism. And then yeah, there's some countries that just over time the leadership is weak until they get strong leadership, and such as Burkina Faso now. I think it's Burkina Faso. And then they rise because of that. The how do we recognize these things? These are the those bullets that you see. Firstly, rapid growth. When these things get going, the gross domestic product shoots through the roof because they expand exponentially, and then they because they're expanding and they're growing the economy, they need to start manufacturing things. They need to build factories and so on. And that does two things. It causes industrialization, and that causes urbanization. So people leave the farms and they start moving into the cities because they start moving from a hand-to-mouth type of economy, subsistence economy, into a monetary economy. I'm listening to a very interesting podcast series by a guy by the name of Des Latham at the moment. And I'm now at 18, it's called The History of Southern Africa, or History of South Africa. And I'm now in about 1840, 1845. And he's talking about the Eastern Cape and how, because of the British effect there and the danger of the track Boers to the Xhosa, and how the Xhosa started working with the British, how the Xhosa economy did exactly that. And how they went from an economy that was subsistence into a monetary economy, and he explains it beautifully. If you just look at the clothing, for example, how people used to wear karosses and animal skins and so on. And I have a kaross a little bit later than that period. I have a kaross here that my grandfather made, and a kaross is a beautiful thing. It's warm, it's lovely, but it takes a lot of work. And he explains this, and he says, and people started to realize, if you slaughter a cow and you want to take that hide and turn it into clothing, it's a lot of work. But if you take the hide and you exchange it for money, and you take the money and you exchange that for clothes, it's a much quicker and easier process. And then you start wearing Western clothes. Of course, that suited the guys from the churches and so on, because the nudity was freaking them out completely. And but it's so much easier on the person. So yeah, investment attraction is the next point. And the investment attraction can be good or bad. In Africa, we've seen a lot of investment from the Chinese, and that's not always been with a good heart. If you want to eat good Chinese food, South Africa doesn't know what good Chinese food is. Either go to China or go north into Africa. I mean, I've sat in restaurants in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, and a couple of other places, Chinese restaurants, where there are not English menus. The menus are Chinese because there's so many Chinese people that go there. In Nigeria, we were normally, when we went to the good Chinese restaurant, we were ushered into a side room because we were Westerners. They didn't want us to sit in the front. They didn't want the other Chinese to actually see us because they were scared that because Westerners were eating there, the Chinese would think that the restaurant wasn't authentic. So we would get our own little private dining room. There were lots of private dining rooms. You could book one. But if we just walked into the restaurant and wanted to sit in the restaurant, they always ushered us into the side and sent in a Chinese lady who could speak English, and then we'd order from that. So investment attraction is great, but it can be for the wrong reasons. Structural changes, I've spoken about agriculture to industry to services, and then the middle class rises. And this is one of the things where we can talk about South Africa, where our middle class is declining, because a lot of these things are not happening in South Africa, and the middle class is where the money is. It's not the big money, but it's the consistent money. And our middle class is actually growing down because they're getting taxed out of their wages. Infrastructure development, you need to develop your infrastructure. If you look at the first point, where you're looking at industrialization, if you don't have the infrastructure, the power, the roads to transport the goods, the technology to support all of that manufacturing, then you're going to run into problems. And then, of course, there are challenges with this. When these things grow fast, or these economies grow fast, some people are going to get really rich, and some people are not going to catch up and are unfortunately going to remain poor and become poorer, because it becomes more impossible for them to be able to make a living. I had the privilege, just about a year ago now, I was in Madagascar, and it's amazing in Madagascar, and they've got these massive rights in Madagascar at the moment, because the poor have stayed so far behind as the country's gone up, and lots of things have happened in the country, but the problem is the infrastructure hasn't stuck with them. So the infrastructure is starting to crumble because it must now cater for industrialization, but it hasn't been developed. So industrialization is pulling electricity, they're pulling water, and the people at the bottom of the food chain don't have electricity, don't have water, and this has now caused riots. In Antananarivo, there's shopping centers that don't exist anymore. I spoke to a lady that I know there in the past week, and she said, that shopping center that we took you to, it's not there. There's nothing. The riots have taken it away. And those are the type of challenges. And then dynamic and evolving transitions. It's things are busy changing, and when change takes place, things change. And the more things change, the more they change. Because it starts to change because of all these reasons, and then that rapid growth takes place, and then things start changing faster and faster. People struggle to keep up with that pace. We talk about countries, Brazil, India, China, many of the African countries. We talk about these countries as being emerging economies. South Africa, it's difficult. We have our problems. We used to be seen as an emerging economy, but if you go look at our growth rate, it is a problem, and part of the problem is, in my personal opinion, is that government, and please note I'm talking about government, I'm not talking about political parties, and there's a difference between government and the ruling party, and if you don't know the difference, go read it, go look it up. The government somehow doesn't understand how to create jobs, and at the bottom of this whole emerging economy, you need to create jobs. Jobs are not created in an economy by government making jobs. Jobs are created in an economy by people like yourselves, being trained in entrepreneurship, being allowed to open businesses, and being able to open a business easy and create jobs. That is where jobs are created. Government doesn't create jobs. Okay, so I differentiate between the two approaches to strategic entrepreneurship in an emerging economy. So there's two approaches. There's a bricolage, and apologies, it's a French word. I don't know if I pronounce it right. My French, my surname is the only thing French about me. The bricolage and the effectuation approach. So bricolage is basically entrepreneurs say, what's available, right? And whatever's out there and whatever they can grab hold of, they would grab hold of, and they would then do something with it, right? So they would look, and if you think about business management, that's very much an outside-in approach, and I'm sure you've been taught about that. Effectuation, those are entrepreneurs that then say, what have I got? They're not looking out there, they're looking inside, and they say, what have I got that I can do something? And according to what I have, they will do something. So it's an outside in and inside out, and we'll look at a little bit more about that. So bricolage, you use your the available resources out there. And you improvise. So if you know somebody has a machine that I can use, that guy knows how to operate the machine. And if I can get that machine, and I can get a couple of hours on that machine, I can get that guy in to come work the machine for me. And I know my neighbor has got some stuff that I can stick in the machine to make product. I'm going to pull these things together and off we go. Now I have a business. I've made a product. Let's go sell the product. And so whatever resources are out there, whatever you can scrounge out there, you will use. While in the effectuation approach, you look, what can I do? So you say, I want to form a partnership. What can I do? And how can I grab onto somebody with what I know? And you building those networks and things. You're not just doing stuff. And then you're going and saying, okay, so can I secure the resources? You're still haven't done, you're making sure you're not going across to your neighbor and say, listen, buddy, I know you've got some stuff, let's go. And in that way, you're using, until you're looking to build up stuff so that you've got that, and then you go ahead and do something. While the bricolage approach is you grab. Bricolage comes from an art term, as I have it, which is similar to a collage, where you take different things and add them together. But the bricolage idea is whatever you found articles, and you stick them together and make an artwork out of that. Okay, so there are 4 contextual settings. So 4 ways in which which a firm, which an organization, which a emerging economy can develop in. The first is the temporal context. So this is the different phases, and as the phases of an organization's development changes, the way in which the organization will work will change. Then the institutional context, which is once again an internal. So as you develop, the rules change. So when you start an organization, an organization would be a very loose, informal type of thing. Excuse me. And the same with an economy overall. It will be a loose, informal, not too many rules. But as it progresses, the rules will become more formal. And if you want to see what formal rules looks like, you simply need to try to import something into South Africa and go look at all the rules, all the regulations, all the classes that there are for importation. And each class has got a different tax. And interesting things within the tax laws, that small nuances. You would think something like a watch like this would be very expensive, and there'd be a lot of taxes. There's no taxes on imports of watches. Why? Because watches are seen as tools, and tools are used to make money, and therefore tools have got no import taxes. So a watch is a tool, so you only pay VAT when you import a watch. You pay 15% and that's it. So that's the institutional context in the emerging economy. The social context. If we think about what I said right at the beginning about how things change and how emerging economies evolve from this hand-to-mouth type of survivalist economy into a monetary economy and then into a global economy, then obviously socially things are going to change. So the social network. So if we think of the traditional way of living, you've got these social groups living together. You've got family groups of several generations in many cases living in one rural household. And they work the land together, or they do what they need to do to make money, whether they're hunters, gatherers, pastorists, doesn't matter. They work together. But when this economy starts to develop, some of the young guys are going to say, well, look, we need money to be able to buy food, because we're not making a hand to mouth. So we're going to go work in the mines or in the factories or the whatever. Now they move away and into the urban areas, and they might meet potential wives there. which are from a different social setting, which when you have a traditional pastoral setting where the family groups stay together, those family groups intermarry and they marry their own kind, or own tribe, if you want to. And that social context then changes because these guys, ladies, whoever go into town, and they form part of the urbanization and they meet new people there and they fall in love there and they have children there. And then they stay there, and they in the traditional areas, it's only old people left. Now, in our mind, we tend to think Africa, and we see a rural plain in Africa with some huts. Go look at Japan. Go look at what's happening in rural Japan. Exactly this thing's happening in rural Japan, where people used to stay, where you have had multi-generational households within one household as recently as 30 years ago. And those multi-generational households have fallen apart. Eventually, the old people die, the houses are abandoned, and that's one of the reasons why you can buy houses that are really, really cheap in Japan in the rural areas. And there's programs if you want to go to Japan and stay there. You can buy yourself a cheap house, you need to fix it, need to stay in it for, I think it's 10 years or something like that. So it's not just Africa, it's everywhere. Then the spatial context, and I've referred slightly to it, the geographical context changes. And it changes as the economy grows. We start doing things like roads. So, for example, there's a road that runs basically from Durban to Cairo, up the east coast of Africa. And there's a similar road that runs down the west coast of Africa. Some places it's called the Fisherman's Road, but it becomes more formal as it goes through the DRC, Brazzaville, Angola, Namibia, South Africa, what we call the N7. The other one's the N3. N1, N3, depending on where they join eventually, sort of, and they run up together further. And those things mean people start to move. But also what happens is where big roads join, you have villages that start doing, and villages become cities. So many cities are actually simply a city because it was at the crossroads of two big roads. And that changes the geographical location of things and where people move. So those are the four contextual settings of the emerging economy. In an emerging economy, the entrepreneur is the one that's driving the economy, and therefore the entrepreneur is the one that's going to be suffering. And there's a whole host of entrepreneurial problems. I'm not going to go through each and every one of those. I think at this stage of your learning, you should be able to, if I was to ask you to write an essay on those 8 or 10 bullet points, I would expect you to be able to do that. I will touch a couple of this. Inadequate infrastructure, so roads, water, electricity, as the economy starts to emerge. An unstable market, especially initially. Markets internally are very unstable. You might have a monopoly one day and the next day there's another player in there. And then you've got the macro environmental impact that also plays a role. And that's problematic. Lack of entrepreneurial skills. People want to start a business, but it doesn't mean that they've got the skill to start a business, to run a business. Very few entrepreneurs are privileged enough to do a course like the one you've done. And they learn by failing. And if they fail too many times, they run out of resources and they can't start again. And of course, then we've got the great thing that the country now has to do all these wonderful things like put in infrastructure, support a urbanizing community, which means hospitals and schools need to be built, overall develop the country, which means infrastructure needs to be put in place, and this isn't cheap. So what do? We tax the guys that are making money. Who's making money? The entrepreneurs are making money. So the entrepreneurs get nailed. Businesses get nailed by heavy taxes. And then the next thing is, and I alluded to that in the previous slide or 2 slides ago, high regulatory burdens. Now we start making rules and regulations because now government's trying to control this whole thing. Government doesn't want this thing to run away from under them and become something that they're not in charge of. So they need to put rules in place. So they put a lot of rules in place very quickly. And suddenly it becomes difficult for entrepreneurs. And that's where it becomes, eventually your economy slows down, as I said about South Africa. We have too many rules, too many regulations that make it difficult for people to start businesses. And you've got the problem as well is in South Africa, because of our governmental structure, we've got national rules, provincial rules, and then local government rules. And you've got to jump through all three of those hoops. And sometimes jumping through one hoops means you miss somebody else's hoop. Now you've got to also, whose rule is this, and how do I do both of these things? That becomes difficult for entrepreneurs within these economies. The GEM, the GEM, we've bumped into the GEM a couple of times already in your studies, and they say there are 4 phases that entrepreneurship goes through: the conception, the startup, the persistence, and the establishment phase. So initially, the conception phase is when you have an idea and you might just start sort of on the side. You might have a job and you still start running this little business and see it's a hobby. It's not really much more than a hobby. And then you start saying, but hang on, I'm making money. I can actually make real money from this. And then you start up. And that's the birth phase of the organization. So now you start saying, but hang on, I'm not just going to sell this to family and friends. I'm going to go out and I'm going to find a place where I can sell this. I might open a little shop. Or a place where I can deliver this service, or I might go to several retail places and ask them to stock my product, or I might find innovative places. I might get in agents and I say, guys, in your place of work, can't you ask people if they don't want to buy this? I'll give you a bit of a commission and so on. And now that works. Now you've started making progress. You've gained a bit of experience. You've burnt your fingers once or twice. You've lost some money. But overall, it's growing, and now you're in the survival stage. And this is where businesses crash. They don't survive the survival stage because they don't have a market, they don't have enough raw material. The market grows too quickly, and they can't keep up with the market, so the market disappears. Somebody buys your product, they like the product, but next time they want to buy a product, there isn't product because you've grown so quickly, you can't supply everybody. So now they don't see the product on the shelf, so they buy something else. And the next time they come there, your product is there, but they already moved on to another product. And then if you get past that, you're in the established phase. Business is over 3.5 years old and is doing well. In South African studies shows a bit longer than that. Most businesses in South Africa fail within the first 5 years. And it's not most businesses that fail. Most businesses don't see 5 years. They fail before the 5 years have been done. Now we move on to the township economy. So this is now a separate part. And the reason why we're dealing with township economy here is because the township economy is a important part of South Africa's emerging economy, right? So for South Africa, the township economy is a important part of how our overall economy develops. And so the township economy, so let's understand how townships were developed. People that were not white said you can't move in these white areas. We're going to make all these areas white, and people were moved out of the areas. So if you stayed in the area, famously in Cape Town, a place like District 6 up there, Sophia Town, for example, people were physically removed and said you can't stay here anymore. And they were put into areas where they stayed with what was then the 4 race classifications, whites one side, blacks, Indians, and coloreds. And within those communities, there weren't any businesses, there was nothing. If you look at what happened on the Cape Flats, people were literally dumped on a desert, and said, okay, there's your house, build your house, there's stuff, build your house, boom, you're right, you're now staying there. Government obviously built some houses and it got better, and I say that hesitantly over time. But people also then struggled to find resources and so on. So people started doing things within that economy, um, and producing things, distributing things. People would buy a big bag of rice, um, and package it and sell it to neighbors. People made little garage shops and so on. And they developed this community-centric economy that was a small, so very few, and only much later on did larger shops emerge that served a bigger community. But most of these were community-driven, community-centric. I almost want to say in a suburb. Um, and this was driven, as I said, by being historically excluded from the mainstream economy. Um, and a informal economy, non-tax-paying economy, self-sustaining economy developed in the townships. And from that, in the South African context, people started loaning money, informal banks developed. In other economies, formal banks developed. If you go look at Grameen Bank in India, for example, which is a community bank, and they give very small scale loans within this township economy, this localized community economy. In South Africa, the closest you'll get to that is Africa Bank, or if you want to Capitec, but Capitec has gone mainstream already. African Bank has struggled. There have been smaller banks. The one in Limpopo comes to mind, that was politically abused, and the people's investment money was stolen. So you have this, but then from this idea of a township economy and a need for community financing, something called a stokvel emerged. If you don't know what a stokvel is, I know students have laughed at my explanation of a stokvel before, but let me give it a go. So a stokvel is a community-based saving mechanism where people within a community, whether it's a group of people that work together or whether it's a church choir or some other community group, say, we're going to band together and we're going to save. So every month we will give a little, and stokvels, I'll give you two examples. So one way of doing is we get 12, 15 people together and we each put 100 Rand into the kitty. We draw lots, and this month, whoever gets the first lot gets all of that money. They get to take that money. Next month, the next person gets to take all of that money, and we each get a turn to 1 month. We get, so if there's 12 of us and each person's giving 100 Rand, it's 1,200 Rand, right? But if each of us are giving 1,000 Rand, it's 12,000 Rands. So depending on and I, when I was working in Gauteng in government, there were a couple of stokvels running there where people were putting a couple of thousand in every month. And guys were taking home big amounts of money once a year. So that's a very basic form of stokvel. Another form of stokvel is where people club together to buy something at the end of the year. So because if you buy in bulk, it's cheaper. So people start paying. And at the end of the year, they buy for Christmas and so on, and for the festive period, they then buy in bulk and distribute it. So it's like a savings club. Another form of a stokvel is where people pay, and some money is given back to people as a bonus. Some money is used for Christmas, but the bulk of the money is kept in trust. And if you need to loan money, you go to your stokvel. And you loan from the stokvel to build a room onto your house, and over time you pay it back. And in that sense, at stokvels, it become almost their own banks. And to the extent that you can actually open, with most banks, a stokvel account. And these days, many banks won't recognize it as a stokvel account. They would say it's a club account, but it's used as a stokvel account. And it's a very important part of the informal economy in South Africa. And so, as I say, it's so important that even banks have started supporting stokvels at this stage. And it's something we've spoken about this actually at my current place of work to say, shouldn't we start something like that? Because it sounds like a nice way of us getting a little bit of extra money. Sorry about that. Okay, guys, that's basically it for the informal economy. Please, if you're going over this, if you're listening to this recording or you going over this, please look at the slides. That first slide that I showed you. So please read the various learning units in conjunction with the articles, so that you are sure that you understand what's going on there. Okay, are there any questions, guys? Anything about tonight's session? First of all, and then if we've dealt with questions about that, then I'll ask questions about the assignment if there are any questions. So firstly, tonight, anything?
Hi, sir.
Hi, Anushka.
I have a question. I don't know if it's completely
Yeah.
related, but this lesson sounded similar to like developmental studies. So that focuses on community development and things like
So,
that.
yes, 100%. Community development would be the social part of this, and how social structures, etc., change over time, whilst this looks more at the impact of the economy and how the economy changes, but also the influence on social. But yes, the two are very much related and very close to each other. You're 100% correct.
Sir, so if this is like a very tough question, but if we want to make a dent in unemployment, from a starting a business and an entrepreneur's perspective, what would you say, like how could those two be employed to solve that problem?
Um, it's not a tough question. It's a very simple question. It's simply a case of whatever business one starts. One needs to try to employ as many possible people. If you want to start a business because you want to address economic hardship, the idea would be to employ as many people as possible. In other words, use as few machines as possible. So it's one of the reasons why personally, every now and again you hear people talking about, oh, it's so nice in America and Europe, fuel stations, there's nobody working there, you just go and put your own fuel in. No, please, there should be a law in South Africa banning that, because you think of the amount of jobs you'll take away. If you look at the building industry, something that I'm quite interested in is 3D printing. And in the building industry internationally, there are 3D printers that they build buildings with. They should be banned in South Africa because of the amount of jobs that building creates. So whatever business you start, if you want to make a dent and change, uplift people socially, you have to create jobs. Because if you create jobs, people have money. If they've got money, they can eat decently, they can stay decently, they can send their children to schools, they can educate their children. So jobs are the key, and that's why I'm saying it's part of why our economy doesn't do as well as it should do, is because our government doesn't understand that they should not be creating jobs. They shouldn't have a public works program. Because what a public works program does is it creates jobs when they're building this piece of road past my house. And the people that are staying in my area have now got to work. But when that road is built 50 kilometers other side, those people now have work. Whilst if they said, look, we're going to put contract out, and the contractor needs to train a certain amount of people in certain skills, then when the contract moves away from here, those people have the skills and they can sell their skill elsewhere. But the way government does it is they do short-term projects for people to work, earn some money on the short term, but it's not sustainable and the people get no skills. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I have tried.
Yes, sir. I just have an additional question regarding that. So, would you say like promoting, I don't know what you call them, but TVET colleges, like skills colleges, like Africa Skills and things like that, would you say
Yep.
that that would be beneficial for our country?
Okay, so you're going to start me on something now, and I'm going to bore everybody with this. So I'll try to keep it quick. One of the courses I teach is management and leadership in higher education. and we look at specifically at the various types of colleges and universities and things that we have in South Africa. The problem in South Africa is everybody wants a degree, right? So people want to go study, so they go study a BA languages. Now, with all due respect, a BA languages can get you nowhere fast. You would do much better if you could do a plumbing course or electrician's course or something like that at a TVET college. We underestimate the power of TVET colleges, and many other African countries have bridged this gap. The simple way is in Ethiopia, for example. Now, okay, Ethiopia is communist, etc. But there, if you want to go study, government says, right, to study this year, these are the jobs that we have available. Therefore, these are the study directions. So, sorry, nobody's going to study BA languages because we don't have any jobs for people with BA languages. A heck of a lot of people can go study plumbing because we don't have many plumbers, right? And that's a problem in South Africa, and it's a community problem because we all want to be the fancy person with a degree. I hold 3, 4 degrees, whatever it is. And I can tell you now, if when I was 18 years old, decided to go do plumbing or becoming a mechanic or something like that, or a bricklayer, builder, I would be much more wealthy than I am today, simply because those are the skills that are really in demand. So our TVET colleges are seen as third cousins twice removed in higher education, when we should actually be saying TVET colleges are where it's at. And the government has acknowledged this to a certain extent. There is, I forget the name, there's some Afrikaans college up in Pretoria somewhere, and that has been well run and well managed, and they're producing excellent students. And those guys are walking into jobs because there's so many jobs for a skilled plumber, a skilled rigger that does crane driving, a skilled butcher, all of those manual labor things that are not unskilled labor, but is manual labor at the school level. And we should be pushing TVET colleges straight to the front of our tertiary education system, and we should be putting much more funding into them than we put into universities. But we want to be fancy, so everybody wants to get a degree. And one of the qualifications actually that I would say is worthwhile getting in terms of a degree, and I'm sometimes quite despairing about a BCom degree, but is your degree, is an entrepreneurship qualification. This actually trains you to go do something in the economy, and it trains you not to be dependent on somebody else, but to create your own job.
I agree,
You
sir.
happy?
Yes, thank you, sir. I was reading an article from the IRR, and they said that Britain had I don't know if it's a law or a target to send from 1999 that sent like 50% of their pupils to university, but now they changed that and said that they should go 2/3 should either go to university, further education, or a gold standard apprenticeship. So just supporting
Yep.
what you just said.
If you've got that article handy, please email it to me or email the link to the article, please. I'd like to see it.
Sure, I'll send it to you, sir. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Okay, any other questions, guys? Any of you want to speak about the assignments? But I see it's my good students that are in class, so but please feel free if there's any questions about the assignment that you guys still want to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye. Chilimanco, Melissa,
Sir,
Mishka. Yeah?
yeah, the last question number 3, like, how is it more just like
Tell
personal
me
feedback?
what question it is. I don't have it open in front of me, or I can
Okay.
go look for it.
Um,
Just remember what's the. I know the questions. I just can't remember
it
which one it
says
is.
reflect on parts 1 and 2, and
Okay.
then it talks
Okay.
about
Got it.
limitations, challenges,
Yeah.
considerations.
Okay. So what you need to do there is, that's a personal reflection. You need to sit down and say, how difficult did I find it? And they give you criteria to look at. And how difficult did I find that to do? That's not in your textbook. It's nowhere else. It's you, yourself, and I. So you've got to sit down and talk about your experience in doing this and what you found difficult and what you found easy. And I think they talk about are there any ethical dilemmas that you faced and so on. So it's simply a self-reflection, and that you would typically write. And we always say, yeah, you must write academically and do references and so on. There'll probably be no references in there. And it will probably be, I found this and I struggled with that. And when I had to look at, so it will be a very personal reflection on the journey to where you are at the moment.
Understood, sir. Thank you so much.
Cool, no problems. Any other questions, guys? Okay, thank you. I see you again in 2 weeks' time. And I believe this is the curriculum. I should have checked, but I believe we've completed the curriculum now. And in 2 weeks' time, when I see you again, I will be dealing live with the final POE. I will send emails out before the time, but I would ask you to work through the final POE before then. I'm not convinced I'm going to get your marks for this one back to you before then, but I'm going to definitely try. And then come to that session with your questions about the final POE and what you have to do. I thank you. Have a good night. Keep well. Cheers.